New section, or why did I say new section? What am I doing? What's wrong with me? Okay, so this is the second video of part 2 of Negative Dialectics by Adorno. Part 2 of Negative Dialectics is titled Negative Dialectics Concepts and Categories. This part 2 has sections, but they're not like titled sections. But if you look at the table of contents, there's kind of like an indication of a break. So I'm reading according to that, and based on that, there will be 5 videos for part 2 of Negative Dialectics. The first section of this second video is titled Individuality, Not the Ultimate Ether. Either. Alright, let's rock. Individuality, not the ultimate either. Confusion about identity tends to make thinking capitulate to the indissoluble. Such thinking turns the object's indissolubility into a taboo for the subject. The subject is to resign itself irrationalistically or scientifically, and not to touch whatever is unlike it. It is to surrender, even to pay homage, to the current cognitive ideal. Such a thinking posture is by no means alien to this ideal. Throughout, the ideal combines an appetite for incorporation with an aversion to what cannot be incorporated, to the very thing that would need to be known. And indeed, theoretical resignation before individuality works no less for the status quo, to which it lends the nimbus and the authority of intellectual impenetrability and rigor, than does a voracious elan. The individual existenz, existenz, does not coincide with its cover concept of existence at large, but neither is it uninterpretable. Another, quote, last thing against which cognition knocks is head in vain. Against which cognition knocks cognition's head in vain. The most enduring result of Hegelian logic is that the individual is not flatly for himself. In himself, the individual is his otherness and linked with others. What is more than it is. This, quote, more, is not imposed upon it but remains immanent to it, as that which has been pushed out of it. In that sense, the non-identical would be the thing's own identity against its identification. The innermost core of the object proves to be simultaneously extraneous to the object. The phenomenon of its seclusion, the reflex of an identifying, stabilizing procedure. This is where insistent thinking leads us in regard to the individual, to his essence rather than to the universal he is said to represent. Communication with others crystallizes in the individual, for whose existence they serve as media. In fact, as Husserl recognized, the universal dwells at the center of the individual. Its constitution does not require comparison of an individual thing with others. For, and this is what Husserl failed to pay attention to, absolute individuality is a product of the very process of abstraction that is begun by universality's sake. The individual cannot be deduced from thought, yet the core of individuality would be comparable to those utterly individuated works of art which spurn all schemata and whose analysis will rediscover universal moments in their extreme individuation. A participation in typicality that is hidden from the participants themselves. New section, constellation. The unifying moment survives without a negation of negation, but also without delivering itself to abstraction as a supreme principle. It survives because there is no step-by-step progression from the concepts to a more general over-concept. Instead, the concepts enter into a constellation. The constellation illuminates the specific side of the object. the side which to be a classifying procedure is either a matter of indifference or a burden. The model for this is the conduct of language. Language offers no mere system of science for cognitive functions, where it appears essentially as a language. Where it becomes a form of representation, it will not define its concept. It lends objectivity to them by the relation into which it puts the concepts, centered about a thing. Language thus serves the intention of this concept to express completely what it means. By themselves, constellations represent from without what the concept has cut away within, the quote more, which the concept is equally desirous and incapable of being. By gathering around the object of cognition, the concepts potentially determine the object's interior. They attain in thinking what was necessarily excised from thinking. The Hegelian usage of the term, quote, concrete, according to which the thing itself is its context, not its pure selfhood, takes note of this. And yet, for all the criticism of discursive logic, that logic is not ignored. But Hegelian dialectics was a dialectics without language, while the most literal sense of the word, quote, dialectics, postulates language. To this extent, Hegel remained an adept of current science. He did not need language in an emphatic sense, since everything, even the speechless and opaque, was to Hegel to be spirit, and the spirit would be the context. That supposition is past salvaging. Instead, what is indissoluble in any previous thought context transcends its seclusion in its own as non-identical. It communicates with that from which it was separated by the concept. It is opaque only for identity's claim to be total. It resists the pressure of that claim. But as such, it seeks to be audible. Whatever part of non-identity defies definition in its concept goes beyond its individual existence. It is only in polarity with the concept, in staring at the concept, that it will contract into that existence. The inside of non-identity is its relation to that which it is not, and which its managed frozen self-identity withholds from it. It only comes to in relinquishing itself, not in hardening. This we can still learn from Hegel, without conceding anything to the repressive moments of his relinquishment doctrine. The object opens itself to a monadological insistence, to a sense of the constellation in which it stands. The possibility of internal immersion requires that externality. But such an imminent generality of something individual is objective as sedimented history. This history is in the individual thing and outside it. It is something encompassing in which the individual has its place. Becoming aware of the constellation in which a thing stands is tantamount to deciphering the constellation, which, having come to be, it bears within it. The truismos of without and within is historically qualified in turn. The history locked in the object can only be delivered by a knowledge mindful of the historic positional value of the object in its relation to other objects, by the actualization and concentration of something which is already known and is transformed by that knowledge. Cognition of the object in its constellation is cognition of the process stored in the object. As a constellation, theoretical thought circles the concept it would like to unseal, hoping that it may fly open like the lock of a well-guarded safe deposit box, in response not to a single key or a single number, but to a combination of numbers. New section. Constellation in science. How objects can be unlocked by their constellation is to be learned not so much from philosophy, which took no interest in the matter, as from important scientific investigations. The scientific accomplishment often ran ahead of its philosophical comprehension, ahead of scientivism. And we certainly need not start out from a work's own content, in line with such metaphysical inquiries as Benjamin's Origin of German Tragedy, which take the very concept of truth for a constellation. We must go back to a scholar so positivistic a bent as Max Weber, who did, quite in the sense of subjectivist epistemology, understand, quote, ideal types, end quote, as aids in approaching the object, devoid of any inherent substantiality and capable of being reliquefied at will. But as in all nominalism, however insignificant it may consider its concepts, some of the nature of the thing will come through and extend beyond the benefit of our thinking practice, not the least of our motivations for critiquing an unreflected nominalism! Exclamation point. So are Weber's material works far more object-directed than the Southwest German methodology would lead us to expect? Actually, the concept is sufficient reason for the thing, insofar as the exploration of a social object, at least, is falsified if confined to dependencies within its domain, to dependencies that have established the object, and if its determination by the totality is ignored. Footnote, quote, this relationship of the whole as essential unity lies only in the concept and the purpose. The mechanical causes do not suffice for this unity, because they do not rest upon the purpose as the unity of definitions. Hence, by sufficient reason, Leibniz understood a reason that would suffice for this unity as well, one that accordingly would comprise in it not merely the direct causes, but the final causes. This is not yet the place to define the reason thus, however. The teleological reason is a ratio of the concept and of mediation by the concept, i.e. by the ratio, end quote. Hegel. And footnote. Without the supraordinated concept, these dependencies conceal the most real among them, the dependence on society, and this dependence is not to be adequately compensated by the individual rests which the concept covers. Yet it appears through the individual alone, and thus the concept in turn is transformed in specific cognition. When Weber in his treatise on Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism raised the question of defining capitalism, he, in contrast with current scientific practice, was as well aware of the difficulty of defining historical concepts as previously only philosophers had been, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche. He explicitly rejected the delimiting procedure of definition, the adherence to the schema genus proximum, differentia specifica, and asked instead that sociological concepts be, quote, gradually composed, end quote, from, quote, individual parts to be taken from historic reality. The place of definitive conceptual comprehension cannot therefore be the beginning of the inquiry, only the end quote. Weber. Whether such a definition is always necessary at the end, or whether even without a formal definitory result, what Weber calls, quote, composing, can be equal to his epistemological goal, remains unsettled. Definitions are not the be-all and end-all of cognition, as popular scientivism holds, but neither are they to be banished. A thinking whose course made us incapable of definition, unable even for moments to have a succinct language, represent the thing, would be as sterile probably as a thinking gorged with verbal definitions. More essential, however, is that to which Weber gives the name of, quote, composing, a name which orthodox scientists would find unacceptable. He is indeed looking only at the subjective side, at cognitive procedure, but the, quote, compositions, end quote, in question are apt to follow similar rules as their analog, the musical compositions. These are subjectively produced, but they work only where the subjective production is submerged in them. The subjectively created context, the quote, constellation, end quote, becomes readable as sign of an objectivity of the spiritual substance. What resembles writing in such constellations is the conversion into objectivity, by way of language, of what has been subjectively thought and assembled. This element is not one of Max Weber's themes, but even a procedure as indebted as his to the traditional ideal, and theory of science does not lack it. The most mature of his works seem at times to suffer from a glut of verbal definitions borrowed from jurisprudence. But a close look will show that these are more than definitions. They are not mere conceptual fixations. Rather, by gathering concepts round the central one, that is thought, they attempt to express what that concept aims at, not to circumscribe it to operative ends. The concept of capitalism, for instance, which is so crucial in every respect, is emphatically set off by Weber from such isolated and subjective categories as acquisitiveness or the profit motive, in a manner similar to Marx's, by the way. In capitalism, says Weber, the oft-cited profit motive must take its bearings from the principle of lucrativity and from the market chances. It must utilize the calculation of capital and interest, organized in the form of free labor, with household and business expenses separated. Capitalism necessitates bookkeeping and a rationalistic legal system in line with its pervasive governing principle of rationality at large. The completeness of this list remains in doubt. We have to ask in particular whether Weber's stress on rationality, his disregarding of the class relation that reproduces itself by way of the barter of equivalence, will not as a mere method equate capitalism too much with its, quote, spirit. Although that barter and its problematics would certainly be unthinkable without rationality. But the capitalist system's increasingly integrative trend, the fact that its elements entwine into a more and more total context of functions, is precisely what makes the old question about the cause, as opposed to the constellation, more and more precarious. We need no epistemological critique to make us pursue constellations. The search for them is forced upon us by the real course of history. In Weber's case, the constellation takes the place of systematics, which one liked to tax him with lacking. And this is what proves his thinking to be a third possibility beyond the alternative of positivism and idealism. Okay, so that's the end of video 2 of part 2 of Negative Dialectics by Adorno. Part 2 is titled Negative Dialectics, Concept and Categories. The next section, which will be the first section of the next video, is titled Essence and Appearance. Thank you so much for listening.